from the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
The GOP softening the plank on pro-life issues and on marriage has given them an opening. And I'm seeing that opening exploited already. You are seeing a lot of progressive Christian outlets saying, well, we have two pro-choice parties now. Now, I would disagree with that, but we have two pro-choice parties, so it doesn't really matter if you vote for Democrats on some other basis.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. Find more at podcast.hillsdale.edu. That was Megan Basham. She's the author of the brand new book, Shepherds for Sale: How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. We'll talk in depth with Megan about Shepherds for Sale coming up later on in today's program. First, we're joined by Dr. John Grant. He is Associate Professor and Chairman of Politics here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Grant, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Today, we discuss an upcoming online documentary course from Hillsdale College, a free online documentary course titled Marxism, Socialism, and Communism. And I'll tell listeners right now, you can sign up at hillsdale.edu/new course. If you pre-register now, you get the first lecture immediately. Everything else released later on in this month of August. Head to hillsdale.edu/new course. Marxism, Socialism, Communism. Why is this course even necessary, Dr. Grant? We have this long legacy of failed attempts to implement Marxism. Why is the idea still around?
Yeah, I think there's a powerful appeal, especially in many places with the decline in various types of religious belief. People long for justice. They want the world to be better. And Marxism promises them not just a better world, but a perfectly just world. There'll be no oppression whatsoever. And that just seems to be really appealing to people, despite the horrendous track record of inhumanity and horrible injustice.
We have professors of economics, of history, of politics contributing to this documentary course. How do you think your approach is perhaps unique among those voices?
Yeah, I think what the politics angle is it overlaps. There's an overlap, and all of us, the economists, have to talk about the political to some degree, and the historians have to talk about the economic, et cetera. But an economist is usually going to focus on Marxist economic theory and then its permutations. And in politics, when I teach this, and I've taught a class on this for a long time now, focus on what does this mean politically? What does it mean in terms of justice? What were the effects? How did it work politically? Is the emphasis, and I think honestly more interesting. Although the economics is important, it's abstruse. And Marx, although he was as famous as an economist, his real passion was politics and revolution. He never finished his masterwork because he kept stopping to try and foment a revolution. Das Kapital, you know.
We have these three terms: Marxism, Socialism, and Communism. It's the name of this documentary course. Again, you can find it at hillsdale.edu/new course. Can you better define or find the differences in those terms for us? Marxism, socialism, communism.
It's a tough one and very interesting. Originally, a Marxist would have said these are all convertible. These mean the same thing. So when the 1840s, say, when Marx really started writing, and he would have said, "Well, I'm a communist and I'm a socialist too," and that's what that means. Over time, socialism has come to mean more of a reformist doctrine. Maybe we can fix these underlying injustices of the capitalist system, of the rule of the bourgeoisie, by things like 40-hour work week, child labor laws, pensions, unemployment insurance and things like that. And by the early 1900s, that what we now call socialism was actually a bitter opponent of Marxism in many ways. And so Lenin, you'll find decrying what he calls left-wing communism, which is the sort of people who thought of themselves as Marxists, wanted the same goal, but didn't think you needed or should have violent revolution to get it. And so I think that's kind of transfers to today. When people talk about socialism, they usually don't mean the dictatorship of the proletariat and other, the need for concentration camps, which is in Marx. He actually talks about that. We don't need that. We can do this through political reform.
Talking with Dr. John Grant about the new documentary course, Marxism, Socialism, and Communism at hillsdale.edu/new course. We want to give people kind of a high-level look at the course and encourage them to sign up, pre-register, get the first lecture now, and then the rest of the lectures later on in August. So we'll ask some sort of bigger questions here. How does Marxism rise in Russia? What allows that ideology to take root?
Yeah, in Russia, the first and for a while the only successful communist regime, it's interesting because the Marxist theory didn't exactly explain, you're supposed to have an advanced industrialized society. So for a long time, even Lenin thought Germany really has to have a Marxist revolution because this, in one way, it didn't make sense to have it happen in Russia. But the very favorable conditions in Russia, the intelligentsia in Russia were very much checked out on the Tsar for a long time, looking for something else. So educated people were open to, if not Marxism, other revolutionary changes. And then the conditions created by World War I, really, I don't think the revolution would have happened without that. The chaos, the government mismanagement, and the Germans using the Lenin's his Bolshevik party as a political warfare. They literally funded the Bolsheviks and sent Lenin back to Russia, famously. They later regretted this, of course, but so a lot of accidental minor things had to happen. It wasn't the working out of the dialectic of history as the theory would say. It was, now Marx would have approved of that, and he actually says in a later preface to his famous Communist Manifesto, if you can skip that and have a revolution, go ahead and have a revolution, including in Russia. There's kind of a tension. So a lot of people say, well, that wasn't real Marxism because Russia was not an advanced industrialized society and then make the transition. But Marx approved. And one of the things I think we learned from the study of the politics of this all, the real heart of Marxism is not an abstract account of history or economics, but a call for violent revolutionary overthrow and a dictatorship that will then transform the conditions radically, including the use of murder, corrective labor, and as I mentioned, this in Marx too, to fix these situations. In
Marxist, communist Russia, is there any daylight between Lenin and Stalin when it comes to their vision for Marxism in Russia? Is there a comparison or a contrast to make between those two leaders?
I don't believe so. I think a careful study of their words, and they both wrote, Lenin more famously, but actually Stalin wrote quite a bit about why he was doing what the real nature of Marxism is, according to him. Stalin is a direct ideological descendant of Lenin. And Lenin, very common argument, Leninism would have been fine, but Stalin took it over and perverted it, and then hence the concentration camps and all these other horrors. But all of that started under Lenin, and mass murder, concentration camps, the punishment of class enemies who, not even saying the individual has done anything wrong, but just you're a member of this group, the bourgeoisie or whatever, and you're going to suffer for that. All of that in Lenin just as much as it is in Marx.
That's Dr. John Grant, one of the contributors to the new Hillsdale online documentary course, Marxism, Communism, and Socialism. More with Dr. Grant in a moment. But right now, take a moment, go to radiohour.hillsdale.edu. That's the website for this show, the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. While you're there, click on the subscribe button right at the top of the page. That will allow you to sign up for our email newsletter. You'll get a note every week, every time there's a new episode. radiohour.hillsdale.edu. Click the subscribe button. And by the way, coming soon, an expansion of that email newsletter to also include additional programming from the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. So sign up now, radiohour.hillsdale.edu. Click the subscribe button and enter your email address to join our email newsletter list. We've been talking with Dr. John Grant, one of the contributors to the new Hillsdale free online documentary course, Marxism, Socialism, and Communism. Lenin certainly was brutal. Stalin was brutal. Later, Mao in China was brutal. Why is that extreme brutality so essential to Marxism?
I think the extreme brutality comes out of the gap between the way Marxists want the world to be and the way it is. And they don't think just making those conditions a little bit better. So giving workers health care or disability insurance, that's just flowers on the chain. You're not actually, so you have to have the violent revolution and then the violent transformation of society, because it won't be transformed without the violence. The regular reformist measures won't get you where you need to go.
Talking with Dr. John Grant, one of your lecturers and contributors for this documentary course on Marxism, Socialism, and Communism. You can find it at hillsdale.edu/new course. If you sign up now, the first lecture is available immediately. The rest will be released later on in August. hillsdale.edu/new course. There's a lecture, a course on the critics. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn is discussed. We spent some time on previous episodes of this show talking specifically about him. For listeners who didn't catch that, Solzhenitsyn, what did he identify in communism, and how did he transmit that to the rest of the world?
I think the great contribution of Solzhenitsyn is to, follow on from our previous topic, show that brutality, terror, torture they're intrinsic to Marxism. It's not an accident. It's not that, bad Stalin or even bad Lenin. If we just get the right people in charge, they won't do these horrible things. And his Gulag Archipelago focuses on, in parts, in this Soviet slogan, nature we will teach, freedom we will reach. And it's in the context of these horrible forced labor projects where hundreds of thousands of people were dying. The idea being, this will transform the physical nature of the Soviet Union to make it a land of plenty, but it will also transform the people doing the labor. It will correct them of their bad bourgeois or counter-revolutionary habits. And that's not a as we say now, that's not a bug. That's a feature of Marxism. Mm-hmm. That's what he shows us.
Present day advocates of socialism often will say, true socialism has never been tried. And those of us on the right perhaps kind of point and laugh. But let's take that seriously for a moment. Can it be argued that we haven't had a trial run, a real experiment with communism and socialism?
I don't think so. It's kind of remarkable how much people like Lenin and Stalin were very conscious of trying to carry out Marx's teachings, and they'll engage in these arcane, abstruse theoretical discussions of the works of the founders, Marx, Engels, the great original Marxist. And when a problem would come up, they would often look back. What do these works have to teach us? Like, how do we deal with this? And they really were very earnest about, and the brutal things that people want to separate out, you can find being advocated in people like Marx and, of course, later Lenin, more obviously, but they're in Marx too.
Present day socialism, communism, we think of Cuba, perhaps Venezuela. Where is this ideology still dominant on the globe?
There's, different people will give different answers on this, of course, but I don't know of any place where orthodox Marxism is the attempt is to apply it at this point. And there's even a big question about whether Maoism was really, or the brutality was there, but some other differences. But the broader socialism and the same passions that really drive Marxism, sort of burning hatred of the world the way it is. And that, I think, is still very prevalent in some of the places, you just named, and even sometimes the idea of a party leadership being necessary and not, these recent Venezuela elections, for instance, seem very sketchy. And of course, for a socialist, well, you can't go along with the results of an election if the results are going to bring you to an unjust conclusion. So it would make sense. Well, let's just not go along with that. Okay, so not the exact same as orthodox Marxism, but common features.
Throughout this documentary course on Marxism, socialism, and communism, there are episodes on the journalist Marx, the revolutionary Lenin, the dictator Stalin, the critics, the acolytes, Yugoslavia and China, and the utopians, the cultural Marxists. In addition to what we've talked about here today, what else should people be aware of what's coming in this course?
I think there's a fair amount about the history of Marxism, which in a way you have to have, because Marxism claims to give a true account of history. It's a very historical. I mean, the facts could be questioned, but in its own understanding. And so this is a great instance where you see the importance of studying theory and practice together. So studying, there's a lot in the course about the Russian Revolution, which I think people will find, very helpful. And we have a guest speaker on this in the course, Sean McMeekin, who's one of the leading historians of the Russian Revolution and has a new book in History of International Communism coming out in about a month. And so I think that's really helpful.
What do you hope people say after completing this course? What kind of reaction would you like to elicit in those students who take this course on Marxism, socialism, and communism?
A more nuanced and sober appreciation for political life and what we can hope to get from it based on the study, getting some real knowledge of this phenomenon, maybe the exemplary instance of ideological tyranny. What does that really mean? And how can we avoid that in all of its forms? Because that doesn't just have to be Marxist, of course, although Marxism and the way it was especially built in the Soviet Union and other places, like China, like Cambodia, in their different ways, really show us the dangers of that way of thinking. It's great education, that, I think.
Dr. John Grant is Associate Professor and Chairman of Politics here at Hillsdale College, one of the contributors for the new online documentary course, Marxism, Socialism, and Communism. Again, find it at hillsdale.edu/new course. If you pre-register, the first lecture is available immediately, the rest released later on this month. hillsdale.edu/new course. Dr. Grant, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Up next, Megan Basham of the Daily Wire will talk with us about her brand new book, Shepherds for Sale: How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Check us out on Facebook. Just search for the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour and join us for updated show and guest information. We're joined by Megan Basham. She is culture reporter for the Daily Wire, also a frequent contributor to Morning Wire, and author of the new book, Shepherds for Sale, How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. Megan, thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate the time. The book is just out this week and available now. This idea of trading the truth for a leftist agenda. How does this work? Are we talking about cold, hard cash always being involved in some sort of trade or agreement? How does this set up?
Well, certainly that is a part of it. And I detail some money trails in my book where you could pretty much point to some fairly transactional arrangements, but it's not always that clear cut. And I do stress for people that we're not always talking about some mustache twirling billionaires in the background of every ministry drift. But we do see that plenty. And we also see what you might call soft influence, where it's not we are giving money to your ministry or we are setting up this sort of evangelical front group to promote particular progressive causes. Sometimes it's simply if you soften your position, you receive much more adulation from the secular media. You'll find yourself being lauded in the New York Times, in CNN, and other outlets like that. And I can understand how over time that tends to have an impact that will make a particular ministry leader soften their position or start to talk about certain issues that are very debatable, like, say, what our immigration policy should be or how Christians should respond to the question of climate change.
The book outlines a number of leftist billionaires involved in these trades or agreements. Some we know by name, some we don't. But Megan, leftist billionaires don't like religion. Why do they care? Why are they interested in what happens in these churches?
Right. And I take a lot of care to point that out. Of course, the name everyone will know is George Soros, and he appears plenty. He's an atheist. Pierre Omidyar, who was the founder of eBay, he is a Buddhist. And so it is interesting to see them, right, involved in so many of these evangelical ministries. And the reason that they care is because evangelicals are roughly 30% of the American electorate. And you have even left-wing outlets like The Atlantic naming them America's most powerful voting bloc. And that's very true. The GOP does not win elections without them. The left cannot advance certain policies without them. And so for that reason, it became really important to these left-wing funded foundations. Really, you started to see them openly talk about it around 2010, 2013. It became very important to them to go, we have to stop directly opposing them, and we have to ask, how do we harness their power?
And this is something you mentioned in the book. It's not, they don't have to convert everyone, but the evangelical voting bloc is such a, as you put it, a roadblock to implementing a leftist agenda that even siphoning off a small percentage can make a big deal in many elections.
Yes. So I think that's why we saw in 2020 such an effort with groups like Evangelicals for Biden, which was spearheaded by Billy Graham's granddaughter. There were groups like Not Our Faith, which was led by former Obama staffer Michael Ware, who's become really prominent in a lot of surprising evangelical circles. He's frequently touted in Christianity Today, in the Gospel Coalition, by Trinity Forum. So places where you in the past would not have expected to see someone who is a political operative for the left. And yet we're seeing that happening. And again, I just don't really think it should be surprising, because it's not even that they must just peel off some of those voters. It's also effective if they can just get them to disengage and stay home. Megan
Basham is with us. Her new book, Shepherds for Sale, How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. There are many different evangelical churches and ministries mentioned over the course of Shepherds for Sale, but the SBC, the Southern Baptist, are perhaps the one that is mentioned most often. Why is that?
Well, for a couple of reasons. One, I am a Southern Baptist, so I know it the best and had a front row seat to a lot of the activities that I detail in the book. But more importantly, Southern Baptists are the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S. Traditionally, they've also been known as one of the most conservative, and they represent roughly 5% of the entire American population. So if your goal is to move evangelicals, to sway them to the left, you're going to get a lot of bang for your buck by investing in Southern Baptist ministries and institutions.
Megan, each of the chapters then discusses a specific issue, and you make care early on. This is not a book of political or theological argument, but we see how these issues begin to seep into some of the teachings in these particular churches. Environmentalism is the first chapter, how we've turned environmentalism in some of these places into something called creation care. How has that message seeped into some of the churches?
Right. And that's a bit of a pattern that you see frequently on a number of topics that I cover in the book. But that one is really stark because when you hear the term creation care as a Christian, you think, of course, I want to care for creation. We all want to be good stewards of the good earth that God has given us. But climate change is something that scientifically we can debate to what degree humans are having an impact on the weather and the temperature, and is it a catastrophic impact? So that is very much a live, ongoing debate, and it's a little hard to say that the Bible clearly speaks to that, and it absolutely tells us how to respond to that. So what you see, though, is these evangelical ministries, seminaries, and we mentioned Southern Baptist just a second ago, and it's important to know that Southern Baptist seminaries educate a plurality of all Protestant pastors and ministry leaders in the U.S. So even if you're not a Southern Baptist, there's a pretty good chance that your pastor or some ministry you may be involved in, that their leadership did come out of a Southern Baptist seminary. So you're seeing some of these seminaries like Southeastern Seminary in Raleigh, North Carolina, they're bringing in speakers and curriculum from climate change activists, well-known climate change activists like Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who's deeply involved with the World Economic Forum. They're also bringing in what you might call sort of astroturfed Christian groups who say, oh, we're here for creation care, but they're also funded by left-wing organizations. And so their purpose is not just to say, let's debate this issue of climate change. It is to recruit students, seminary students and pastoral leadership in particular, to promote particular legislation, things like cap and trade.
And it should be noted, Megan, as we talk about any of these issues, essentially, that they are not necessarily brought into the conversation as a debate or sort of entering into some sort of discussion. There really is this test of biblical faithfulness that if you are now not entirely embracing this idea of creation care and don't make it a core mission of your Christianity, that something is wrong with you.
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that is part of the way that this message is being promoted, that it's not just, hey, let's have a debate about how Christians should respond to this issue, but it's actually to be faithful to the gospel. And that is something that a speaker at Southeastern Seminary, for example, actually said. You have to take up this issue to be faithful to the gospel. There's another name for that, and it's legalism.
Megan Basham with us, her book, Shepherds for Sale, the chapter on abortion and post-Roe environment. There are churches, there are some pastors that are using the fall of Roe to argue now for a bigger government. And this trope that certainly leftists use all the time on pro-life activists, saying, oh, Christians, pro-lifers, they only care about babies before birth. They don't care anything about them after birth, and they're hypocrites about that. Is that kind of argument actually making its way into our evangelical churches?
Yeah, I have to say that after the Dobbs decision came down 2 years ago, I saw some really surprising people who I had thought were extremely pro-life, who had been very outspoken about their pro-life convictions, like the editor of Christianity Today, Russell Moore, was completely silent for a couple of weeks about the issue. He wrote nothing publicly, said nothing publicly. And that was surprising, because normally that is someone who, when he was critical of Trump, would be immediately out with some essay, sometimes within hours of some negative Trump news coming out. So that he went a couple of weeks saying nothing was I think, really telling. And part of what he and so many others did once they did speak about it was to say, and we have to be clear, by the way, I want to backtrack and say that all of these people that I'm speaking about when it comes to this pro-life issue were very frequently never Trumpers. They didn't like Donald Trump. And so I think this put them in an uncomfortable position so that when the decision came down, the issue had to be about something else. So they started to redefine pro-life, one, to mean a whole lot of other things beyond just protecting babies in the womb, like racial justice or immigration issues or things like that. But then also, once they did that, they were giving aid and comfort to what is a lie, which is that Christians don't care for mothers once they have babies, because they absolutely do. And I go into great detail in the book about the tremendous work that churches and ministries put into caring for mothers in non-ideal circumstances when they have a baby. And not just that, but also to show the negative impact that we've seen on certain segments of our society by responding to these issues by saying, well, what we need to do is expand entitlements, expand the welfare state, and essentially replace the need for fathers.
A chapter on Christianity Today, which you just mentioned in the course of that answer, it's not a publication that I actually often read. I guess that's good at this point, but explain for our listeners, too, who might not be familiar, what was Christianity Today? What's happened to it, and why did it lose its way?
So Christianity Today is known as Evangelicalism's flagship publication. It was founded by Billy Graham in 1953. And over those decades, it's been incredibly influential in evangelical churches. I think it was sort of the magazine of record for Christians, for Protestant Christians is how you might think of it. And then really, I would say maybe about 10 years ago, I think it was drifting left before that, but it really about 10 years ago, people started to notice, wow, it seems to have really taken up progressive causes. It seems very embarrassed of its conservative base of readers, conservative evangelical base that you would not expect. And so part of what happened is, one, I would say that it began taking money from large foundations like the Lilly Endowment so that it was no longer as beholden to its subscribers. And it's worth noting that the money it was taking from the Lilly Endowment was not for some clear Christian charitable exercise that everyone would go, yes, okay, we want to ensure that, say, needy kids are fed or something like that. The reason they're taking this money is to create pastoral preaching training initiatives. So it was to shape preaching. And I think that's important. And then the other part of it was that staff came in, newer, younger staff who were themselves very progressive, very liberal. And one of the ways I demonstrate that is to show that between 2015 and 2022, you had a lot of staff at Christianity Today making political donations, which you would know, Scott, is a little bit of a no-no.
Yes.
Including quite a number of their editorial staff. Their news editor was among them, and they all went to Democrats, every single one of these donations, including hard left Democrats who support the LGBTQ movement without qualification, abortion. Elizabeth Warren was among these candidates. So I think you can just say it was a combination of outside influences, but also a different kind of staff coming in.
I wrote that down, and you already addressed the question, but 74 political donations from 2015 to 2022 by staff and board members, every single one of them to Democrats. Shepherds for Sale by Megan Basham is a deeply reported book, too, with tons of citations throughout and at the end of the book, so you can see it there. COVID-19, the fifth chapter in Shepherds for Sale. I tried to figure out the best way to describe this, because so much of this chapter is about what I would say evangelical pastors, evangelical leaders laundering the credibility of Dr. Francis Collins, who was in charge, partially in charge of the response to COVID in Washington. How did that happen, and why did they go so far to defend him?
Yeah, I really feel that COVID was the moment where all of us who had felt a sense of disquiet over a number of years over some things we were seeing in the church suddenly had clanging alarm bells in our ears. The way so many pastoral leadership, how so many ministries handled it was just a neon sign that we have a problem here. And one of those neon signs was Francis Collins. So for those who aren't familiar, he was then the National Institutes of Health director, so otherwise known as Anthony Fauci's boss. And he was touted as this sound Christian evangelical in the halls of power. So really presented as, hey, he's one of us. And he made the rounds to a number of well-known Christian podcasts, media outlets. He appeared in quite a number of interviews with very well-known pastors and Christian leaders, people like Rick Warren, N.T. Wright, Tim Keller, Ed Stetzer, Russell Moore, others. And he was very much presented as the expert that Christians need to listen to. And part of what Francis Collins argued was, one, he obviously promoted the government's what I would call authoritarian COVID policies, including things like vaccine mandates. He spearheaded a campaign called Love Your Neighbor, Get the Shot. So the implication was, if you are following Christ's command to love your neighbor, then you have to get this vaccine, even though there were some very good reasons for some demographics to not want to get the vaccine. Say, for example, women of childbearing age who were trying to get pregnant and didn't know how this might impact them. And then the other thing I would say he did with all of these interviews and using all these platforms and borrowing this credibility was that he covered up some COVID lies. He said, for example, in a live stream with Christianity Today, that the virus definitively did not come out of a Wuhan lab, that nature made it. Well, of course, we now know that he knew at the time, he and Fauci together both knew that it was very probable that it came out of a Wuhan lab. And then there was the fact of Francis Collins' own Christian character. So all of these well-known pastors and leaders acted as character witnesses for Francis Collins. They told us that he was a man you could trust. He was a strong Christian brother. They told us that he was pro-life. Well, his actual record is that he did in his role at the National Institutes of Health strongly defend the ongoing trade in aborted baby parts for experimentation. He funded that. We saw experiments like infant scalps being grafted onto lab rats. That was something that the NIH funded under his watch. And then even more than that, Francis Collins himself declared himself a strong LGBTQ ally, and he spearheaded an initiative for transgender research on children. It included giving cross-sex hormones to children as young as 8, puberty blockers, mastectomies to girls as young as 12. And that was something not that just went on under his watch, that he specifically touted as, here is a program that I initiated, and we are very proud of this in the NIH. So certainly someone that a lot of Christians, had they known this background, would have had a lot of reason to doubt his Christian bona fides.
Megan Basham with us. Shepherds for Sale is her book, How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. There are so many head-scratching moments throughout Shepherds for Sale. This is not a head-scratcher, but it did pop out to me. If anything is directly analogous to Soviets' successful efforts in the 30s to 50s to smuggle socialism into American churches, CRT is it. How is critical race theory making its name known inside of our evangelical churches?
Well, early on, explicitly so. I think, around 2019, like a lot of people, I first kind of became aware of critical race theory and what it was. But most of us didn't know what that acronym meant, CRT, when we first heard it. And at that point, I think while a lot of people's guards were down, you had evangelical institutions and ministries just bringing it in, saying, here's this new tool, critical race theory, that Christians can use to analyze racial politics and systemic injustice in the U.S. You had, again, the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S., the Southern Baptist Convention, directly doing that. A pastor, a theologian, an academic who was concerned early on about what he was seeing wrote a resolution for the Southern Baptist Convention's annual meeting. And the resolution was condemning CRT as something that was unbiblical and opposed to Christian ideology. And once that resolution went into the SBC committee that year, they rewrote it to make it something that recommended CRT as an analytical tool that we could use alongside scripture. And of course, that's a huge problem, because what CRT does is essentially takes Marx's class struggles and replaces it with racial struggles. So the minority groups become the oppressed, and white people become the oppressors. And everything about Christian worldview is opposed to something like that. One, we're told that there is neither Jew nor Greek, that we are all one. Two, it teaches people to constantly monitor to see if they're being treated as well as someone else, or if they're having a microaggression committed against them. So it really teaches us to focus on our grievances instead of gratitude. And so in so many ways, it's just really divisive. And that was a chapter where I spent a lot of time presenting personal stories about how this particular ideology has impacted the church and the terrible division and distrust it's created.
Megan Basham, I have two more questions I hope to get to in the few minutes we have left. This is something that pops up over and over again in Shepherds for Sale. You have so many great personal stories from people who have had experiences inside the church. And I know it's going to be different for everyone, but based on your discussions, what can you tell people about when to confront, when to violate the 11th commandment, as you explain in Shepherds for Sale? And then, as some people take that next step, when to leave a church?
Well, I actually am a pretty big advocate of confronting early on, but maybe we don't use the word confronting. If you start to have concerns about some things you're hearing, I feel like that should be an ongoing conversation with your pastoral leadership. You should know your shepherds well enough that you're going, hey, I don't know. I felt like that was a little strange. I don't really see how, say, our immigration policy must necessarily be something that we're promoting in church, because there are other ways to love our neighbors. And we might say that that particular policy is hurting some of our neighbors. And so I think as soon as you hear it, it's okay to start having those conversations. You have them respectfully, you have them graciously, but you do ask some questions because your church also belongs to you. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, I think if you're having those conversations and there is a demonstrated lack of discernment, and I can't give a hard and fast rule, but I can give you an example for us during COVID, when we were in a church that we had first moved to Charlotte. We liked it. We liked a lot of the people. We had some concerns that it felt like it wasn't going very deep, but those are easy to dismiss. But when I started in that era of COVID in 2020 and the George Floyd riots, receiving emails from my children's ministry director telling us how to talk to our kids about their white privilege, that for me was a moment where I went, no, we are leaving this church. My husband, we are leaving this church, because I realized at that point that we had a sickness in the church that was going to impact my children. And while I might be able to discern and filter out some of those messages biblically, I didn't know that my kids could. And I didn't want them getting conflicting messages from their pastors than what they were getting from me and my husband. So at that point, we left. So, I think that's a matter of a lot of prayer and a lot of discernment. But certainly, I would say don't be passive.
Final question for Megan Basham. We have this massive shift in the presidential race. And you had mentioned earlier in our conversation the way some religious communities began advocating for Joe Biden. Catholic faith, but you had evangelicals for Biden. Kamala Harris now apparently will be at the top of the ticket. Do you think that changes the calculus when it comes to the churches, especially evangelical churches, and how they approach this November matchup?
Well, I do think it's going to be harder to present Kamala Harris as a person of faith in the way that evangelicals for Biden and Christianity Today and outlets like that presented him as a man of faith. There was a lot of coverage at that point that said, well, he's very serious about his Catholicism. He attends church. Never mind the fact that he backed policies that were directly opposed to Catholic teaching. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to be harder to do with Kamala Harris because she does not at least have that public display of religion that we saw with Joe Biden. But on the other hand, I think you could argue that the GOP softening the plank on pro-life issues and on marriage has given them an opening. And I'm seeing that opening exploited already. You are seeing a lot of progressive Christian outlets saying, well, we have two pro-choice parties now. Now, I would disagree with that, but we have two pro-choice parties, so it doesn't really matter if you vote for Democrats on some other basis. So I do think that maybe that was a misstep that has given them an opening. But I don't think you can make the argument as strongly as evangelicals for Biden did.
Megan Basham, her new book, Shepherds for Sale, How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. You can also find her writing over at The Daily Wire as culture reporter. Megan, thank you so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Scott.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. John Grant from Hillsdale's Politics Department and one of the professors in the new Hillsdale Free online documentary course, Marxism, Socialism, and Communism. And Megan Basham, her brand new book, Shepherds for Sale. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews, Megan Basham this week, or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.